Welcome to Chapter 5, 5.1, Fundamental Identities. Basic trig identities is where this first video is going to begin. I'm going to break this up into little pieces just to keep our time under control because you all seem to like that a little better. All right, starting off at the very beginning, identities. Some things we know to be truth always, okay? Starting with your reciprocal identities. All right, and you actually, we've been studying these a little bit. You just maybe didn't think of them as an identity. All right, so let's start out. Cosecant of theta. Reciprocal of cosecant is 1 over the sine. Okay, secant theta, 1 over cosine. Okay, cotan of theta, 1 over tan. Okay, so they're just the reciprocals of each other. Okay, so then if I go with the ones you know right off the top of your head, maybe sine of theta, 1 over cosecant. Cosine theta, 1 over secant. And last, tangent theta, 1 over the cotangent. Okay, so there's a good place for us to start with the reciprocal identities. Okay, on your trig sheet, on your packet, front page, if you're following along with that, you will find these 6 listed as the reciprocal identities. Okay, all right, next up, quotient identities. Okay, we'll start with tangent of theta. Okay, you got to think about, what do you know the tan to be? Well, we've been talking about it as the sine theta over cosine theta, most recently when we went through and did our trig graphs. All right, cotan of theta is going to be cosine theta over sine theta. Okay, so again, they're just for the reciprocals of each other, so their ratios are, or their quotients are reciprocals. Okay, so those are your quotient identities. Those also somewhere here on your trig sheet that I gave to you on your packet, you'll find those 2 listed as well. Maybe you take a highlighter, highlight those 2 sections that we've talked about those. All right, next up, probably my favorite, or ones I remember most often, most used, are going to be your Pythagorean identities. Okay, these are good to put in your mind. If you've not written anything else down so far listening to the video, you might want to write these down. Okay? All right, so let's think about unit circle for just a second, because I haven't brought that up today. Might as well talk about him for a second. All right, so we know our friend the unit circle. I apologize for my bad artwork, but it's all right. We can make this work. Okay, so we know the radius on the unit circle to be 1, okay? So if I were to think about putting a triangle in here, and we, again, have been talking about cosine is, I'll call it t or something just to be different, and then sine t. So we're thinking of that as our xy values when we put a point anywhere on this circle, okay? So I'm going to just throw a point over here. Then I'm going to drop in a little triangle, okay? And so we're saying these are for any real numbers, t, all right? So out here, we would actually have the cosine of t and the sine of t, all right? Because over here is your cosine and then sine. And then we know that the length of this hypotenuse on here is going to be 1. Okay, because again, it's a unit circle, we know that to be 1. Okay, so if we were to move that triangle anywhere we want, any quadrant, okay, what relationship would be true? Well, remember, I'm leading into Pythagorean identities. All right, so what we know now is cosine t squared plus sine of t squared is going to equal 1 squared, which is just 1, okay? That's going to be your bread and butter. That's your basic Pythagorean identity, okay? And if you don't like it that I put a t on there, okay, fine. Let's just say cosine squared t In fact, we can write it this way. Cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta equals 1. That's how you're going to see it most often, okay? So there's our first identity. All right, now, let's take that first one, this basic identity, and suppose we divided through by the cosine squared. All right, so I'm going to take your basic. Okay, so this is, I'll call that number 1. Okay, second identity, let's go cosine of t squared. I'm just going back to the bread and butter one at the beginning. All right, so let's take this one and divide through by the cosine squared and see what we get. Okay, that sounds like fun. Let's try that. Let's put this in green. Let's divide everybody by the cosine squared. So if I divide through, I'm not changing the value, I'm just changing what this looks like. Okay, so then we're going to end up with, if we divide through, well, cosine over cosine, well, that's just 1. Plus, oh, sine over cosine. Huh, what was that up here? Oh, yeah, up here. Sine over cosine is tangent. Okay, so this is going to be the tangent squared of t. And then 1 over cosine, oh, that's reciprocal. 1 over cosine, where's 1 over cosine? Oh, here, secant. Okay, so that's going to come out as the, I probably should write it the same with square, not to mess you all up. Secant squared t. In fact, let me go back and take this out. Okay, so then this here would have been tan of t squared. Okay, so I think maybe you're catching on to how I'm writing this, that the square on the outside is the same as if I were to write this to you as 1 plus tan, whoops, sorry, get out of there. I'll get better at this someday. Tan squared theta equals secant squared theta. All right, so that's your second identity, okay? So this is the first, this one's the second, okay? Then we've got one more Pythagorean identity, okay? Can you guess what I'm going to do? Well, if this one I divided through by the cosine squared, then lastly, I'm going to divide by sine squared. Okay, so let's go back to that original. Cosine squared plus sine of t squared equals 1. This time, I'm going to divide through by the sine of t squared. All right, so let's take a look at that. All right, so I'm going to do this divide again. So this time divide sine of t squared. Sine of t squared. Sine of t squared. Whoops, squared. Okay, so what do we get this time? Well, cosine over sine. Okay, so you can look back to your identity. But cosine over sine is over here. Cosine over sine, well, that's just cotan. Okay, so we're going to have, let me switch colors here. Let's go to, back to black. So we'll go to cotan of t squared. Okay, so I'm just substituting. Plus, well, sine squared over sine squared is just 1. Equals 1 over sine squared. 1 over sine. Hey, right there. That's cosecant. Very cool. Cosecant squared. Okay, so then when I write it, put the thetas in and clean this up a little bit, you're going to see it written as cotan squared theta plus 1 equals cosecant squared theta. Okay, that is your third Pythagorean identity. So cool. And again, those are on your trig sheet. Make sure to highlight those. These are very important. Any upper level math you go to, these identities, you'll see them. Okay. All right, so just for fun, let's do maybe a quick example. And I didn't have this prepared ahead of time, but we'll throw it in here quick. So we could do something like find the sine of theta and the cosine of theta if you're given that the tangent of theta is 5 and that the cosine of theta is greater than 0. Okay, so it would be positive. All right, so let's think about this for a second. We've got cosine involved. We've got a tangent involved. Okay, so one might try something like this. You could say secant squared theta equals, typo, secant squared theta equals 1 plus tan squared theta. Okay, so, well, what's that mean? Well, if the tan is 5, then we have tan squared. So that would be 1 plus 5 squared. So 26 equals secant squared theta. Okay, so then if we take the square root of both sides, plus minus, secant is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 26. Okay, great. Okay, but I was trying to find out the sine and the cosine. Oh, yes, you're correct. Secant is 1 over cosine. Okay, so then we have plus or minus 1 over square root of 26. So if we just do the reciprocal of both, cosine is going to equal plus minus the square root of 26. However, we want the cosine to be positive because it says here, so we don't need that plus minus. We want just the positive case. All right, so cosine should be the reciprocal, square root of 26, positive. All right, so secant's 1 over cosine, and then when we take the reciprocal, cosine is square root of 26. Okay, so then we need sine. Well, let's take that we know that tangent is sine over cosine. All right, well, if the tangent is 5, we don't know the sine. We know cosine is the square root of 26. Okay, so then if I multiply both sides by square root of 26, we end up with 5 square root 26. That seems to be the value for the sine of theta. Okay, all right, and we've got that done. I think I'll stop here and rejoin you in a few minutes in a second video. Okay, again, make sure you've taken good notes, Pythagorean identities, reciprocal, and quotient. Have a fabulous day.